And there it is.
Hey there,
Take it away,
everybody.
Mark.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome to our weekly Restoration Agriculture webinar with the Ecolonomics Action Team, EAT, um, talking about forest ecology. I believe this is our fifth official session that we're in this. And we're in for a special treat because I don't know if you guys remember last week, the beginning of the webinar, we had a little banter going on, and there was severe storms expected up north. Well, on Thursday, the day after the webinar, the farm crew and myself, my family, took off and sought shelter at a local bowling alley because the storms were so severe here. We woke up the next morning to find out that in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in northern and eastern Minnesota, there was a significant blowdown of trees, like several thousand acres of trees blown down, a couple people killed, a whole bunch of people injured. And so, of course, I immediately took off. We're talking about disturbance. This is absolutely perfect timing for this particular webinar. Unfortunate circumstances with the catastrophes. I know how brutal it can be out in the Boundary Waters when these storms come up. My boys and I were in a series of 14 tornadoes once. They were probably 10 and 12 years old. One of the scariest things I experienced. So I'll show lots of pictures from up there. And remember again that I'm presenting on actual topics out of college level forest ecology texts, but I'm coming from the perspective of a person who was originally turned on by tree crops, J. Russell Smith, the need for humanity to figure out a permanent agriculture, some way that we can permanently inhabit this planet, not destroy it, actually enhance it, repair, restore ecosystems while providing ourselves with food, fuel, medicine, and fiber. Early on, I discovered permaculture, which the name itself is a contraction of the two words, permanent and agriculture. And the phrase that has been one of my operating phrases since I first read about permaculture was that the aim of permaculture is to create systems that are ecologically sound and economically profitable. And that's the whole gist of ecolonomics, ecological economics. If it's not ecological, it's not going to make business sense long term. And we might as well have an ecological economy and an economic ecology. Did I say that right or repeat myself? David Holmgren started putting forth a list of principles that we unfold permaculture on the ground through a set of principles. We observe nature, imitate nature, natural patterns, and interact with the systems. And that's basically what this whole webinar series on forest ecology is. How on earth can we understand and how can we create systems that are based on observing nature and imitating nature if we don't even know what we're looking for or what we're looking at? So the rest of these principles, we'll talk about those through time. But for now, we're observing in order to imitate and interact with. Some of these texts, way more texts than this are in use. I just only have pictures of these ones right now. Now, this may seem silly, and I know I've done this in a bunch of presentations before. But if we're going to observe nature and interact with it, we have to know the difference between an observation and a concept. I write about this in my book, Restoration Agriculture. An observation is something that you see, hear, taste, touch, smell, measure with instruments, derive through testing. And if I write down the protocol of what to do in order to observe a phenomena, and I give this protocol to you, and you follow the same procedure, you'll observe the same phenomena. You may call it by different terms or whatever, but you'll observe the same thing. It's repeatable. It's something that we have verified that you can verify, someone else can verify. Where the concept is merely an idea. And a classic illustration of this is the word invasive species. Human beings are the only species that we know that has an idea called invasion. So when we use the concept invasion, like we're seeing through these concept-colored glasses, we don't actually see reality, we see an invasion. And so what we do is we fight against the invasion. We're actually doing work and doing inputs based on a false view of reality because we're seeing our concept instead of reality. The other one is the word orchard, an apple orchard. If I say the word apple orchard, most people get an idea of what it looks like in their mind because we've seen it, like these orderly rows of trees with nothing but grass, maybe bare dirt in places underneath it. So here's these trees existing within this matrix of reality, and when nature does what it does, and it always does, all of a sudden we see an insect come in, we've got a pest problem, we've got to spray against the pest. When diseases come through, we've got to spray against diseases. Well, there's no problem there. That's what nature does. There's pests and diseases and wind and all these different things that we're talking about are part of observable reality. And to all of a sudden fight against observable reality in order to preserve our concept, our idea of what an orchard should be, it's foolish and it's a waste of time, resources, money, and it's doomed to fail in the end, all it has before. And if you're going to try to establish a farm that looks like this one in the middle here, if you're trying to do that through a series of concepts, that you have these ideas, I'm going to do an apple orchard here, I'm going to do a chestnut grove there, you're not necessarily going to succeed as well as if you had just said, I am going to work with the observed natural plant communities of this place, manage the water, and accept feedback from all of these interactions as it changes through time. How we understand all those things is by having a good understanding, an intellectual understanding, emotional understanding of forest ecology, which is why we're going through all of this exercise. I wrote a book, buy it. A lot of this is explained. The forest, the three-dimensional ecological system dominated by trees or woody vegetation that exists in a dynamic interaction. That's the whole key. It's a dynamic interaction. It is not static. It is not set in time. It's constantly moving, constantly changing, exchanging with the air, with the earth, and of course biology is part of it, creatures, insects, and so on, pests and diseases. All plant communities change through time. In order to work with nature and interact with it and accept feedback from it, we need to know how it changes through various different time scales, short-term and long-term. Now, ecosystem change occurring through the short term, which is decades to centuries, is called succession. The species will change. Notice this little field here, they've got their USDA terraces on it. If they start an alley cropping system, planting rows of trees between their fields of whatever that is, corn or beans, over time, the numbers of species in that field will change because other weeds will come in that row. Maybe they'll plant other species, grapes and currants and so on. The structure, the shape, the physiognomy of the whole system will change. The total biomass there will change. All that change, that short-term change, is called succession. This is a fascinating photo I found today while rummaging about putting this presentation together. This is a photo of my house at New Forest Farm in southwest Wisconsin in 1996. The first winter, 1995, 96, we lived in the downstairs, there's my cursor, with just the foundation here. This was a outhouse. Our telephone was out in the chicken coop at the time. Long time ago. Notice like hardly any vegetation back here. This has been a full year that everything's had to grass in. This was mostly abandoned crop fields up the top here. This was all pasture. This was all pasture. This grand old maple tree is still there, and this path going down the middle right here, this vehicle path, this is still a state right-of-way. This is the old Highway 56. And look on the right, you see these little tree guards around some trees here. I believe these in the front are hazelnuts, and that one back there is a chestnut. Some of the first plants we put in the ground. The system changes through time. This is probably later on in the fall, out on this ridge here. You can see these different fields. This would have been cover crop and squash or cucumbers, cover crop, squash and cucumbers, cover crop, squash and cucumbers. In the early years, we grew lots more annual produce in order to cash flow as the trees grew. Believe it or not, there's trees planted all out in these old overgrown pastures. There's trees planted between the alleys of squash and so on. And then this is one of the first aerial photographs. I believe this was 2003. Notice there's no buildings out front here. This whole pattern that we see on the ground is the water management pattern, so that any water trying to go down this valley gets spread out to the ridges and it soaks in on the ridges. We'll talk a lot about that later on. Just 5 years after that is when this next aerial photo takes place. And you can see even in our own lives, we go through succession. This house started as a concrete bunker, then we had a roof above it. Then we added on front and added on the side. We added on to the outhouse now as a wood shed and a mushroom propagating building. So as our lives change through time, I started this project when I was 30. I'm now over 50. We have different abilities to work all day, different activity levels. We also have different financial means. We go through succession, and what's happening now is my sons are 20 and 22. They're almost old enough now to become signatories on the property, and it's time for them to become the property managers of it. And the biological community and the plants has changed. I have some aerial photographs just from last year, and this area right in here is completely closed canopy, and you can't even see the roads. It's not completely closed because grass grows underneath it, but it's incredibly closed in. And managing succession in our system is what it's all about. We want to be able to manage the direction of succession so we know which trees will be our crop trees in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years, and so on. And we know what trees will be there to replace them. So we're taking a long-term view and a short-term view simultaneously. So we're cash flowing with our short-term crops while always improving our resource base through time and knowing where we're going successionally. The successional pathway of anybody's ecoregion is mostly known. We know what plants will grow in your area. We know the general shape and pattern that ecosystems take, the physiognomy. And if you're in the desert, you're not going to want to try to grow a tropical rainforest unless you do a lot of site development and water management for hundreds of thousands of square miles, etc. But what I found out when putting this together, I was going to talk only about succession tonight, and then I realized that succession just doesn't happen in this cute little process that you go from like rocks to lichens to herbs and shrubs and grass and this Haith mat and jack pine, black spruce, aspen, and balsam fir. It doesn't just do that over time all by itself. There's constantly these little insults to the system that happen in various different ways, and these are called disturbances. Ecologically, any kind of, I'll have some definitions later, but any kind of change within the system is caused by some sort of disturbance, and we'll go through some of those. I also went through this section kind of fast last night because this relates to both succession and disturbance, is that once upon a time, the ranges of the native flora and, of course, fauna was radically different simply because there was ice all over the place. And as the ice melted, these different plant communities spread out from their central homelands of where they were. And this little map right here shows some of the directions of some, like of spruce over here, white pines, beech, and chestnut. And they're various different, there would have been refugiums down here and over here. These guys kind of moved this way and that way. What's fascinating about the movement of trees as populations is that it's remarkably slow. The smaller seeded plants like aspen, birch, willow, they can fly in the wind and they go zillions of miles, hundreds of miles anyways, and find a piece of bare dirt, a touchdown, and poof, they're growing again. And especially plants like aspen and cottonwood and willow that propagate quite readily from the roots. They just send out root suckers all over the place. They can go way far afield in advance, but the heavier seeded trees, our fruits and our nuts, I think it was hickories, only moved on average about 117 meters a year on average as they migrated through 10,000 years. So if we are actually entering a period of climate change acceleration, our current plant communities don't have the ability to move fast enough to keep up with the changing climate. And so that's part of where our role as restoration agriculture farmers comes into play, is we may be going out in advance of places, planting trees slightly out of zone, either too hot or too cold, in order to get new little refugia established from which the population can spread from there forward. And we're doing the breeding subsequently to breed the plants that are now more site adapted, way out of their zone, 1, 2, 3 zones out of their league. Now, ecologists and foresters define disturbance to mean any kind of discrete, observable event, identifiable event that can change the ecosystem. It changes their structure, the species composition, how the ecosystem functions. It can be the components, the landscape components. It can be the landforms change themselves, like landslides, earthquakes. Obviously, you can see here that this vegetation was intact, no longer is. Now these exposed patches of soil will undergo succession. So there was first a disturbance, and then succession occurs from there. Obviously, volcanism. This forest here, it got its life changed radically, kaboom. One of the things that we'll talk about later on that's really significant for us as restoration agriculture people is that we are now going to be the ones that are setting up refugium, ecological refugium, biological genetic refugia of a wide diversity of species that we go out a zone or two ahead of time, or we go into abandoned land, or we go into land that's been, catastrophically destroyed by earthquake, volcano, mudslide, or whatever, and set up a new node from which all these useful species can spread, and we have plenty of food to feed ourselves and whatnot. That's how these systems recolonize themselves. Only like within 3 years, they were finding fungus mycelium all through the volcanic debris out there, and then it was green the very next year, flowers like you wouldn't believe. Amazing how fast it's revegetated. Disturbances includes soil erosion, debris flow. Some of the, like you look over here in this stream here, some of this debris was picked up from somewhere else and deposited there. There can be floods where silt is spread out over crop fields. There was the Root River in Minnesota a few years ago. There was a flash floods that occurred, and I saw a big, huge tractor with articulated in the middle dualies front and back that was sticking 2/3 up out of the mud. It was like buried. Easily a third of it was buried as it rooted itself down into the mud. Then the floods continued. The tractor had to stay there. I don't know how the operator got out and all that kind of stuff. But then the local gravel road washed out, and it totally covered that field with 3-4 inches of gravel. So here was this tractor stuck in a nice muddy bottomland field with gravel on top of it. And if you look at this cut bank here on the stream, you can look at the successional layers of different flood debris that's been deposited. It's not just a clean soil development, soil profile as if you're out in the middle of a deep prairie looking at the soil change down to the subsoil and the parent material. There's layers, different layers of different flood events depositing soil. Disturbance includes the disruption of the existing vegetation. There's of things that can disturb the vegetation. If you look around through this picture, you can see like over here and over here, over here, over here, there's like dead trees. For some reason, those individual trees got disturbed. Now there's an opening in the forest canopy. Now a different kind of succession can occur in those openings because of that type of disruption. Glaciers obviously are very disruptive. They can be quite fast, actually. There was one glacier I remember up in Alaska when I was living there that in a period of weeks, it just like slid across a fjord, and it blocked off a fjord, and it trapped all kinds of dolphins and seals and fish back there until the lake filled up behind it, and then the lake overtopped it and eroded through the ice, and then it was open passage again to the ocean again. But obviously all of this rock material totally crushed up. Plants now have to go through succession after this glacial disturbance. Some of the definitions, you can footnote these and look them up if you want. A forest that kills at least one canopy tree, we saw that in one of the pictures earlier. It can be the mechanisms which limit the plant biomass by causing its partial or total destruction, which we'll see a lot of those, or events that make growing space available to either survivors or new colonists. And think about this right here. This is really bizarre. I think we are living in a societal disturbance, that there are events going on that are making space and other resources available to survivors and new colonists. There are all kinds of opportunities for people who are taking an ecolonomics approach. Look at this, what we see here, this clear cut. This looks like serious hardcore destruction for mile and mile and mile after mile after mile after mile. That's amazingly inexpensive real estate that can provide a tremendous opportunity for us to go in and do genuine ecological restoration at a profit. We can purchase the place, manage the water with terraces and swales and all that kind of stuff, plant our trees, and start selling products the very first year, and start alley cropping and selling annual products off of there. Now, when flood, fire, disease, or pest outbreak kills organisms within ecosystems, we want to understand how that system recovers. and the organisms that'll be there to replace those. Because if we're going to be planting ecosystems in our place, whether it's in your suburban front yard or a 3 million acre ranch, we want to know that when a natural disturbance happens, what's going to follow after this? How do we interact with that in order to obtain a yield? Or how do we go to this site and disturb it in some way so that we can obtain a yield? And then what do we have in place to continue yields forward into the future? We need to be constantly thinking about how to use disturbance, different types of disturbance, in order to accomplish our yield objectives and our sustainability objectives. Now, disturbances can be all different scales. They could be huge scale, like Mount St. Helens, for example, or like a comet, slamming down into the Earth. I just saw a presentation earlier in the spring at Madison, Wisconsin, where they were talking about the comet that basically finished the age of the dinosaurs. That when it hit, it would have put up enough heat would have gone off into the atmosphere that the temperature would have gone up to about 8,000 degrees for like 3 seconds. Well, that's not very long, but I mean, 8,000 degrees, that's pretty hot. It's like almost like a nuclear weapon just boom, erasing life around the planet. That's a pretty major disturbance. Or you get down to something simple like a single tree blown down by the wind and crashing on your building. Now, disturbance will affect the physical site. It arranged the parent material. If you look back here, the rock in the soil was disturbed. We'll see a lot of that coming up. It creates new landforms, new shapes. There's new places for plants to get established. And what right now, these are pictures of New Forest Farm. What I'm working with right now is light interactions. By selectively disturbing in an area, I'm opening it up for more light because it has to grow in order to feed the cows. And I also take the biomass. It's building materials, poles, mushroom substrate, firewood, and then the branches get chipped on the ground for fungus and additional carbon on the soil. So I'm playing with thinning areas to let the light in, and what I need to know is understand what's here to replace what I removed in order to continue having a continued harvest into the future. So in here in chestnuts, for example, as the chestnuts start to crowd each other out, some trees don't do as well as others. You can see in the middle here the grass is starting to go away. It's not growing as vigorously, where you still get light. We'll deal with these light flecks later on. Actually, light flecks through a forest canopy are an amazing field of research. All you do is you put a light meter down and have it send data to your computer, and as the sun goes through the day, all of a sudden it will measure, bleep, all of a sudden this little beam of light comes through the forest canopy and moves on. Very significant in forest energy dynamics. So with a little bit of disturbance, you can take a place like this, boom, and turn it into that. It's a radically different site. Some sort of disturbance, open it up. We have different heat and different light characteristics on that site. Obviously different species composition, because you see there's now a lot of black locusts lying on the ground here, and there's a lot of chestnuts that are standing free, dominating the site. Now, of course, exclusion of disturbance is its own kind of disturbance. This is a picture of some redwoods in what's now the Redwood National Park in California, and these are two photographs from the same exact place. I think it was only 30 or 40 years different, and you can tell here's this tree here with the hollow in it. And most of the redwoods are fire tolerant. They're tolerant of low level ground fire, and they quite frequently they lived and existed with fire. When Europeans showed up, they noticed all these beautiful groves of redwoods growing in the grass, and all kinds of elk were out there grazing, and deer and so on. And so immediately, in order to protect the forest, we've got to prevent fires, and so fire exclusion for at least 50 years in the U.S. was the policy on how to deal with forests is prevent all fires. Well, then what happened, of course, is all these other species come in. These are the replacement species for the redwoods when they eventually come down. Well, now, if you light these on fire, the fire will climb right up and then go to the top of the redwoods and burn those. So it's actually set up a pretty dangerous situation for a lot of these larger, older trees, that as long as it's a low-level ground fire, they're fine, they're fire tolerant. But if it's a crown fire, all bets are off. So excluding disturbance is its own kind of disturbance. It sets up its own new type of criteria. Now, I'm not saying this is right and this is wrong. What we need to do is we need to understand that there are differences here than here. And if this was our place, we have certain options available to us and certain tools and techniques that we should use in order to interact with this system in a way that helps this system to thrive. If we have this system here, we have a different set of management practices that we would use in order to accomplish our objectives. And which ones we use, that's up to us, and we'll figure that out through time. And there's things with disturbances is they all interact with one another. The complexity layers get pretty weird, and you're not always able to tell what exact thing caused the official disturbance. Here is a disturbance, a single pine tree. This is a Korean nut pine. It lived 10 or 15 years, and then all of a sudden, that was it. It just quit. Was it ice damage that broke branches that allowed fungus to get in there? And then the fungus weakened the tree, and then because the tree was weak, was it not able to survive insect damage? And then because it was insect damages, did it not survive the drought? You know, who knows what killed the tree? The tree died, there was a disturbance that happened. All these different multiple disturbances interacted with one another. So when I go out, as some of those pictures up above, and I've thinned the black locust out of my chestnuts, I know that. I'm removing the black locust. I know I'm going to have the chestnuts behind. They're going to dominate the site a little bit more, a little bit better. They'll gain a little bit because they have more water, more nutrients, more light for them. I also know that the locust is going to resprout, and then that sets up a new management issue. And how do I deal with the resprouts? And then how I deal with the resprouts sets up new management issues, which sets up new management issues. They all compound each other, and we have to learn how to deal with this complexity. If you know how to paddle a canoe or a kayak in whitewater kayaking, we can't change what the river is doing, but with a little bit of skill and a little bit of knowledge, we can steer our kayak pretty effortlessly in that stream. Now, most plant communities don't start from scratch from the bare rock, like I've showed a couple different times, and in the videos, the specialty videos that we shoot, I deal with that extensively with the lichen, then the mosses and grasses and so on. Most plant communities are going through some sort of secondary succession where there was a plant community there, then some kind of disturbance set it back, and then it starts succession over again. The biological legacies are the organisms that are left behind from the pre-disturbance state. So you see here, this is a site in California that in the late 1800s was cleared for timber, obviously, and planted to grass to raise horses. This is actually from the ranch where the prize-winning horse Seabiscuit was raised. And there's these groves of redwoods. This one's probably, this is small and about 10 or 12 foot across at the base, pretty big tree. So these things will be able to reseed the site. All the brush and associated trees with it can recolonize the site when disturbance out here stops. It's getting noisy out in the hallway there. Most disturbances are patchy. They aren't, uniform all throughout it. And this is two different pictures of different places where a forest fire had raged through this mountainous area. And anywhere where you see like this dark green here, for some reason the fire didn't burn those trees. Why? We don't necessarily know. There's a lot of randomness that has to do with it. Randomness is, I think, more significant than people are willing to admit, because a lot of researchers like things to be statistically neat, and randomness doesn't always compute. But you don't have no idea why. So these biological legacies are left behind. There are refugia from which the system can reconstitute itself. And human disturbances are still disturbances. From an ecologist's point of view, from our point of view, we are not exempt from how this planet works. Just because we cut down all the trees and scratched off all the dirt, bulldozed it all up and mined off all the ore and left toxic waste piles doesn't mean that that site wasn't disturbed. It was. It used to be all this intact, contiguous forest that had probably at one point in time experienced fire or wind or earthquake or volcanism or something that disturbed it along the way, grazing and browsing by animals. We're just another kind of disturbance, and because of the scale of our and the ability of our machines to do a tremendous amount of work, our disturbances can be really, really impressive these days, pretty huge. And agriculture, I think, is one of the most significant disturbances that humans have perpetrated on our environment. in the fact that annual agriculture has only been around for the past 10,000 years or so. And there are some places that used to be either grassland or forest that were cleared, plowed up, disturbed for agriculture, and have been under tillage, under agriculture for 4,000 years. And actually there's places, speaking of opportunity, a few slides back, Union of Concerned Scientists has data showing that within 5 degrees of the equator, there was, what's the number? I think it was 95 million square miles of land that used to be tropical forest, either monsoon forest or rainforest, that was clear cut, planted to annual agriculture for a few years until it was no good anymore, washed away and oxidized, and abandoned. 95 to 100 million square miles of cheap real estate that we can revegetate into restoration agriculture paradises. What an incredible resource. And what an incredible need. The need is great for us to go out. Why shouldn't we go to these sites and, quote unquote, reclaim them, but do it at a profit because they're setting up profitable business ventures producing, oils, industrial ingredients, food, fuel, medicines. And one of Wayne's companies pioneered the practice of doing this in a constructed environment in brownfields, going to toxic waste sites, cleaning it up, refurbishing buildings, and upgrading the quality of the real estate for resale. It's exactly what I've been doing with restoration agriculture for the past 30 years. Buying degraded property for cheap, restoring ecological processes and systems while planting the trees, shrubs, bushes, and vines that will produce yields that I can harvest and sell to pay the bills. Now, physical legacies left after disturbance. So the biological legacies are all the different plants and animal communities that survive the disturbance. The physical legacies are things like bare soil, like that mudslide I showed you, rearranged mineral soil, and new micro-topography, little changes. And if we look down here right now, this is taken this past weekend up in Minnesota after the big blowdown on Thursday. And these micro-topography changes, these little piles, all this organic matter, all this stuff now creates a new growing media for everything else. The physical legacies are as important as biological legacies. Wind is one of the more significant disturbances out there. We'll have to deal a lot with wind on our site, whether we want to or not. And wind, we're not really able to change too much about it. We have to be able to adapt to it and adapt our management to it. This is a picture taken from one of my favorite places in Sawyer, Michigan, at the Warren Dunes State Park. And these sand dunes are some 200, 300 foot tall. And it's beautiful. We can go through the successional pathway from sand that's never had any vegetation on it, all the way through the grasses, the shrubs, the bushes, to just on the other side of these sand dunes, there's old growth oaks and beech, and about a quarter of a mile inland, there's probably the largest stand of old growth beech east of them, or probably anywhere in North America, I don't know. Gigantic 3-4 foot diameter beech trees, smooth as can be, beautiful trees. So the wind has shaped the land itself, physiographic effect, big, huge dune shaped. A lot of the driftless area in southwest Wisconsin doesn't have drift, and drift was from the melting glaciers and then the wind blowing it like drifts. Here we are. This is a picture of the backside of my wife Jen in the front of a canoe on Nelson Lake up in Boundary Waters canoe area. And what we see here, it's kind of hard to detect unless you know what you're looking for. But you see all these white stems, these bare white stems. The top of this ridge didn't have much wind damage. The bottom didn't have much wind damage. But the middle third, all the way from over here, all the way across, all these stems, almost every single aspen and birch, as far as the eye can see, just snapped right off at about 12 feet off the ground. And what you can do is you can observe the damage that happened by the winds to do a little detective work to figure out how the wind interacted with that site. And what you can see here, these clouds, see how they're flat on the bottom? They're riding, going eastward, kind of northeasterly here. And they're sitting on top of this pocket of warm air that's over these lakes. And in the upper Midwest, as the warm surface area gets hot, can hold a lot more moisture, these little clouds can build up into cumulus clouds and gigantic cumulonimbus clouds, and then they hit the upper atmosphere, they get too cold, too heavy, they crash down as rain, thunder, and lightning. And evidently the winds were coming so strong across here that as it came across a somewhat flat landscape, it suddenly dropped down. There was an eddy current. So this whole section of trees, the trees were actually snapped up, even though wind was blowing this way. It's like water pouring across a waterfall. This is a hydraulic. This is just an aerial photograph. This was in one of the newspapers up there in Two Harbors, Minnesota. Just zillions and zillions and zillions of trees down. This is also from a newspaper. This was Forest Service clearing one of the portages. If you can imagine, there's hundreds of people that are out there in the wilderness that have somehow survived this windstorm. Well, some perished, and some were severely injured and had to be evacuated by people through these portages between lakes. And they had however many other people that just wanted to get the heck out because it was a bad experience. So when we went in, some of the more major portages they had cleared. There were 2 portages that we went across that had all kinds of debris across it. You'll see some of the pictures we took. One of the most widespread examples of how wind affects the micro topography is pit and mound topography. The wind blows, the tree falls over, it rips a pit, and then the root ball, what we would call the root ball in the landscaping trade, it's called the root plate in ecology and forestry. It remains behind. That becomes, over time, as it decays and erodes in the rain, it becomes a mound. Now, those of you guys who are diehard permies and know me that I'm a swiler, I like my swales and burns. This is a perfect example of a swale and a burn. When we're doing a water management strategy, making a depression and a mound, we are imitating this effect, the micro physiographic effect of pit and mound topography. So when the trees are uprooted, it's most common on shallow soils, rocky soils, real sandy soils, soils with a restrictive layer like a hard pan layer, iron pan, clay pan, a certain level deep, or like down in lowland, swampy areas. If all of a sudden, for some reason, beavers build a new lodge and flood out this low area, the soil becomes anaerobic, the trees die and the roots rot, and then they fall over. There's pit and mound on the flats. That's more likely to happen on anaerobic soils. This is actually a photograph of one of the campsites that we stayed at. Had a lot of damage. We were there after the blowdown, not during it, thank goodness. And then as the tree falls, it rips up the soil with it. Depression is the pit, and the root mass itself becomes the mound. This one, look at the shape of that, how incredibly sharp that angle is. This was almost a perfect wedge shaped. And what it was is over in this rock here, there's this crack. And these pine trees somehow got established in the duff in that crack and grew for years, probably looks like 20, 30 years old at least. And their roots were not able to penetrate in any crack at all. And they were just totally within this little wedge-shaped thing. And it was the weight of the soil. Well, what soil? The soil that the biology created around itself through the successional process that just stood that tree up. In one little blow, you could actually have picked this tree up if you had a big enough grabber and just carried it away. It was like taking it right out of a flower pot. Now, the upthrown root in the soil mass forms a mound adjacent to the pit. So are pits and mounds, the most common form of micro topography change with wind damage. So here we've got just off screen below is the pit, and here's the mound. The size of these pits and mounds is determined by the soil conditions, the tree size, rooting habit. 1998, I think it was, we had a lot of rain and a lot of big oak trees came down, and they brought with them this big, huge, round glob in Wisconsin. It was a real heavy clay soil that they brought with. Up here in Boundary Waters, the soil is relatively new. It's only been out of the ice for a few thousand years, and it's solid rock. Just sometimes, there is no soil at all, and everything's just growing on the solid rock like the last one. This root mass here was attached to a gigantic pine tree, maybe 2 feet diameter, and the height from the bottom of that root mat to the top, easily 20 feet. It was huge, just as a gigantic, huge root plate. That's what they call it. Now, what happens is at these sites, it's no longer a uniform strata. What's happened? The tree falls down, it lifts up all these rock, all the soil and debris, and then it all gets mixed together from the erosive effects of rain, and as these roots rot. This is interesting. This was on the same campsite that had a lot of wind damage this storm. This is probably from 1998, I think it was, when there was a huge blowdown straight line wind up in Boundary Waters and just knocked this one over. See, the trees started to rot. There's a lot of organic matter accumulating down in the soil. What happens now is you have a whole new set of sites that weren't there before. This can only provide so much rooting site for various different plants. Certain plants can't get established in here. They need some bare mineral soil to get established. Well, they have it down here. And if we look in the bottom of the pit, we see this perfect little example. We've got this little mulch collecting pit, and these little tiny pine trees got established, and all the needles now fall around them and mulch them nicely. And we got some stones in here for some mechanical protection. If they get stepped on by a moose, it'll be protected. The pit and mound system is part of how forests regenerate. So swales and berms are imitating this pit and mound system. It'll obviously be moister in the bottom of the pits, drier on other sites. As the dead roots decompose, the organic matter minerals come mixed together. You watch those rocks all tumble down. It's now mixed together. And think about that. We're told, there's actually just a few days ago in one of the permaculture press things, talked about how important it was to never, never, never turn the soil, because turning the soil is evil and it destroys it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's not really what nature says. Every once in a while, like this, look at that. All of these rocks and all that soil has been dug up from 2 or 3 feet deep, lifted to 6 foot high, and allowed to mix through time. Sometimes it's appropriate to go ahead and mix this soil, and on these solid rocks where there's hardly any soil to begin with, to start mixing the mineral soil with the organic matter. You'll have more active sites going on where life can work on the rocks. You can have more acids exuded, more fungi, more of the minerals can come into the bodies of the fungus and lichens. You will actually accelerate the creation of a highly mineralized fertile topsoil with the proper amount of disturbance and mixing. How nature does it, it's on its own time scale. That's not necessarily optimizing creation of thick topsoil, rich topsoil, but look at the color over here. It's a nice, dark, rich topsoil. And then we mix it together with more minerals, and it can begin the process again. More organic matter mixed in there. There's some oxygen mixed in there, some water down at the bottom. We're creating healthy, rich soil where there was rock before. Just looking at this picture, which part of this will likely to be hotter? Hello, looks like the sun over here. It's very parched, very dry, hardly anything established there. Down on the bottom, it's very dark, humid, moist. Probably there's puddles there, and so many plants can't get established because it's too wet. And when that ice freezes, expands, and contracts, it can destroy a lot of plants down here. Now, there's this little sweet spot on this particular mound where there's a lot of vegetation that's gotten established. We've got some balsam fir moving in here, over here as well. And so what we have to do, instead of just saying that we'll dig our swales and our berms and you always plant plants here, or you always, put, mulch here or not there, or you don't do swales and berms altogether because they're stupid and unnecessary. They're imitating a natural process. They create these differing microsites, and the different microsites will be, if this was facing east, this would probably be different than if it was facing north, than if it was facing west. There are different conditions if this was mostly clay soil or very rocky, gravelly soil like it is here. The different orientations will affect it. High rainfall versus low rainfall, sand, rock, clay, all these things affect it. They're all imitating natural processes, the pit and mound architecture. What's fascinating here is, once again, we get these old ones next to it. Not everything, not all of the wind effects will totally uproot the trees. But we have an old uprooted one. This was from 2 or 3 slides ago with the little pines in the pit. And then on top of it, a lot of these balsam fir come up. But then look over here, we got a white pine. This white pine is probably in the pit of the previous blowdown. This site was incredible. There was hundreds of years worth of pileup of trees blowing down and falling over on this site. Why on earth anybody from Forest Service would think that this is a good place to put a campsite and drop trees on people? I don't know why. Now, of course, the decaying tree itself is its own microsite. That organic matter on the ground is not going to waste. There's a whole host of organisms that live almost exclusively in this wood. All these lichens are taking any unavailable nutrients and minerals in this wood and turning it into biomass. Mushrooms are amazing is that they can take cellulose, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and somehow magically convert it into proteins. And I don't exactly know the process of that. And so you can take all of these different proteins, now it becomes food for people. Let's inoculate down logs with fungus of our choice. And look, we got little trees established. Certain trees like eastern hemlock, for example, redwood is another. A lot of the coastal Pacific Northwest coastal cedars, yellow cedars, etc., western hemlock prefer to sprout on rotten wood as well. So that decaying tree holds a lot of water like a sponge. The leaf litter mulches the newly established trees. And what you got to see here, this is pretty dramatic. Look at the shape of the land here, okay? And then all of a sudden there's like this little lump, and this way. This right here is the remains of a once upon a time ginormous tree that fell over and has begun to rot. And then you can see subsequent blowdowns knocked more trees over and more trees over, and these are the most recent ones knocked over. Here's some other ones that got blown over. This whole entire site is nothing but a wind site. Wind is the disturbance regime on the site. Just blows trees down over and over and over again. Gaps in the canopy now allow the extra light in, just like I did with a chainsaw. It allows more rainfall, more light into the understory. Reflected light is quite significant too. So reflected light will come into the system, bounce up in underneath, and affect foliage over in here. These little trees now that somehow had gotten established in the last disturbance, boom, the overstory is removed. They now got full sun. They grow like crazy. And these are mostly balsam fir and white spruce, and they require full sun to grow. So that disturbance now provided an opportunity for them. Now, on your property, let's say you have some very valuable plants here, like my chestnuts. They're somewhat shade tolerant. They'll be all right, but they can't grow completely closed in. So when the black locust starts to shadow over them, I go in and I remove the black locust, I open up this pocket, boom, and then it'll give an extra kick of growth to my chestnut trees. Now, wind is interesting, and it tends to remove the overstory trees. I showed you that picture along the shore where all the birch trees were snapped. A lot of the fir and spruce, they tend to snap and they fall over quite easily. White pine is kind of in the middle. It has a tendency to all of a sudden shred its branches. A branch will just snap right off, and you have a ship mast with a couple of scrizzly branches sticking out of it. So you can see here, somehow this one, white pine managed to survive year after year after year after year of blowdown on this site, and just stand there. All the stuff falls down and rots and decays, and just stands there, raises up its branches up above the whole scene, and hopefully some of its seeds will land in some of the mineral soil in one of the pits and mounds. Fire, on the other hand, tends to remove the understory. Now, this is a picture of a 2-year-old fire site in near Ely, Minnesota, south of Ely, Minnesota, and notice how it really removed the understory. Pines, hemlocks are similar to redwoods, like in that they can handle light ground level fires, and they won't burn and perish. Balsam fir and spruce, they tend to, even when a light ground fire goes by, it'll kill the tree. Balsam fir is amazing because it has these little sap bubbles in the bark that'll just kind of burst and explode, and they're extremely flammable, extremely flammable. This is the same site as this one here. This is a 2-year-old fire recovery site. Now, what I like to point out here is look how the grasses have really thrived. You go, all of a sudden, you get a fire that comes through. Some of the first ones that respond to the grass. So now we know that this is a natural process. There was perhaps wind throw came through here and knocked a whole bunch of trees down. So we see this going on. Well, then some kind of a light fire goes through, leaves an overstory. This looks like a silvopasture system. Now we have opportunities for grazing in here. We can introduce a new variable, a new type of disturbance into our system, grazing, and we'll talk about that in a future webinar. Some of the most beautiful trees I've ever seen are in these fire-dependent, understory cleared situations. This is in on a small spot up in the near the boundary waters, called, of all places, white pine, gigantic 400- or 500-year-old white pine trees. Now here's an interesting situation we saw earlier with the redwoods. We have an understory that's grown up right almost up to the underside of the canopy of the story up above it, and this poses a little bit of a challenge. If this is a natural system here, such as it is in Minnesota, if a fire comes through, the fire has nothing preventing it from climbing all the way up this vegetation, starting all the way down here, gigantic catastrophic crown fire. So if I have a piece of property that looks like this, and I live anywhere near a place that has any wildfire, whether you're in a dry area or a moist area, I mean, in California, if you're not managing your place for fire, you must be on something that's legal in Colorado, because fire is part of the natural ecosystem, and if you want to defend your resource, your life, your food system, you will go ahead and manage to protect yourself from fire. This is a prescription for a disaster. If wind comes through there, it's not a big deal, knock everything down. And if a fire comes through there, it's just going to climb and destroy everything. So what we want to do is we go through, and if we can act as the wind, and we can remove understory trees here, and thin out how many overstory trees we have left, imitate the effects of fire, and have some grazing going on underneath, we have acted as a disturbance, and we're patterning our behaviors after how wind affects the system and how fire affects the system. We don't want that. That's not a good thing for your property, no matter where you live. Okay. So it's as much the disturbance regime that drives succession as it is the plant communities themselves. And you can learn the type of disturbance regime of a site by just looking at the legacies that are there. The stumps, the torn material, the pits, the mounds, the patterns, broken branches on trees. And if you look at this here, we've got these young balsam firs in the background are all in a line on an old rotten body of a tree that's on top of another old rotten body of a tree. These are all in a line that sprouted on a rotten tree. And here's another one, and then this is one from just Thursday. So this is probably 100 years, 200 years maybe of evidence of what has been going on at this site. The trees have grown up. A wind comes through, knocks a whole bunch down. There's pit and mound architecture going on. Some stragglers survive. Most likely white pine in this particular area, because it just shreds its branches and stands up like a ship mast and doesn't put up a big target to the wind. And we can see this in the landscape. Look all around here. Most of the birches in this area have been shredded in the recent windstorm. All the green, the light green that you see under here, is the balsam fir in that understory, happy for the release. Up grow these birches and aspens, boom, their tops get ripped off, they snap right off. The balsam firs dominate the site. Well, then balsam firs aren't very wind strong. What's going to happen next? Another wind comes through, knocks all those trees down, and some of the pines manage to hang on and survive. Some actually were in a thick clump. That clump hasn't been thinned by wind yet, but now if you look at it after this disturbance last Thursday, they're pretty exposed, and I bet you there's going to be a few of them. They've had their roots weakened, they're a little wobbly. We get a couple more blows this summer, they're going to start to drop out and thin, and so you'll end up with a forest canopy here. That's the birches and there's maples and poplars and fir and spruce in the mix with that whole canopy layer, all having different responses to the wind. The birches and poplars snap, they sprout again from the roots while the fir and the spruce occupy the site. Well, then the fir and the spruce grow over, and the birch are there for a while, and they blow over. Meanwhile, there's fewer and fewer, but larger and larger white pines that are the emergent layer in this forested system. And you can see here how some of these larger ones got thinned out. There'll be fewer and fewer trees, but larger and larger. And notice how skinny. That's a very narrow wind pattern, how they just break their branches off at the side. Try dragging a canoe through this stuff. This was a blast, by the way. The smells were amazing of all of the pine and spruce and fir. Just a phenomenal amount of trees down. There's another gigantic, this was probably 10 or 15 foot tall root ball, root mass. And it looks like a crazy mess, but all of this understory, there's a lot of understory that's a very fire tolerant, such as raspberries and blueberries and service berries and hazelnut, beaked hazelnut up in this particular area. There's a reasonable amount of oak in this area as well. All of that understory will thrive for the next few years until the next disturbance comes along, be it fire, be it wind. Look at this old guy. It's been there for how many different windstorms has this thing seen go by? And so I think these are beaked hazel in the foreground. We've got some maple over here, And then I think this is my last slide on this particular island here. Some of the things that we also see with the wind is the long-term trend. And by looking at this picture, you see all of the trees, the larger trees leaning to the left. Some of these, like this here, the only branches that have survived are the ones on the leeward side. So anything that was facing the wind got ripped off and snapped and broken. And the whole tree has a general lean. A lot of the lean isn't always just the catastrophic winds that do that. A lot of that is during the growing season when the candle, the new growth is growing. Many of the trees on my farm, New Forest Farm, they actually lean to the north, even though our prevailing wind is like southwesterly and northwesterly. It's like, well, why do they point north? Well, during the growing season, when they're the most tender and green and flexible, there's the hot south wind is blowing them north just enough to kind of keep them there for a month or so. So this actually may be a result of just long-term, slow, steady winds, and it just keeps bending when it's flexible and growing. Or a lot of it might be from the catastrophic blowdowns like happened last week. And so we see a little bit of legacy here that's going on. This was probably, once upon a time, a bare rock site. Went through primary succession. The lightest seeds would have come in first, would have been willow and aspen and birch. That these little tiny seeds can float in the wind. They land on the bare rock or the place that the lichens have kind of prepared. They start to grow. Well, they're not very wind fast. They blow over periodically, but that's okay. They sprout from the roots. They send up root suckers, and the aspens and willows send up root suckers. Pretty soon they colonize the whole site. When one blows over, there's a little bit of pit and mound architecture. Pine also has very small seeds. They kind of blow in, and pine can start to dominate that site. And over time, all the wind susceptible trees like the spruce and the balsam and the birch, the aspen, and the willow, they all snap or they fall over, and the pine come to dominate the overstory and are left behind. So once again, here's a several hundred years, just by looking at this and understanding disturbance pattern of this area, we can understand the history and what actually happens on a site. So if we're going to be observing long and protracted observation instead of a lot of senseless work, it's prudent for us to understand how to read the legacies of this landscape and understand what that tells us about the disturbance regime, how that disturbance regime affects the plant communities that we're going to be using when we set up a restoration agriculture system on this place. So the first type of disturbance that I spent a lot of time on was wind. We're going to spend a significant amount on fire and a whole bunch of different other disturbances next week. But for now, I guess what we can do is we can open this up for questions. I guess I do have a few more slides. What's interesting about it, the site conditions determine now how the genes in those plants express. If it's a particularly hot and dry site, like here on this bare rock, only the ones that can really survive these harsh conditions will be able to do that. If it doesn't have to survive that kind of drought, it can use extra water. This isn't getting very much water. It'll start to express these genes. These ones, children will propagate instead of these ones, children. Can't survive this kind of cold weather and you freeze and die in the wintertime, you don't get to reproduce next season. So the site conditions are also part of our breeding program, and they will be guiding us. So back to this picture here, by understanding the history of this place, by reading its legacies, by the legacy landforms, the legacy biology, and then by understanding the disturbance regime and how the disturbance regime affected the plant communities that we're going to use, we now know how to adapt our breeding program to work with this particular disturbance regime and to select more quickly the species or the individual varieties that will thrive on those in those conditions with sheer total utter neglect. I almost said my word wrong. And back to plant migration, we also have a certain responsibility now to advance plant migration forward. Here is that grove of butternuts that I talked about briefly last week up in Maine, in a very wind-driven and actually harvest-driven disturbance regime. These sites, northeastern Maine, has been harvested for almost 200 years, over and over and over again. And what has determined the forest of today is who's been able to survive the kind of logging we were doing at the time. But this is the same. It's instead of white spruce, it's a lot of red spruce, a lot of balsam fir, a lot of birch, a lot of aspen. There's beech in here as well. So we throw in these new species, these new walnut species that we knew automatically by the plant communities that were here, by the legacies that were here, that it's a very wind-thrashed site. And we are going to expect that this will behave in such a manner that there will be a lot of wind disturbance. So there will be a lot of removal of the birch and the aspen. So if we go in and remove the birch and aspen and have our butternuts stand behind and take the brunt of the wind, they're fairly well anchored, they're a sturdy tree. We will go out ahead and remove the stuff that the wind hasn't removed, if it hasn't done it in a timely manner. And then we will make sure that the brush layer is clear. So we're taking care of what the fire would be taken care of by keeping the ground level open. And so we can take plant communities from out of zone, move them forward, and treat them the way to be treated in order to survive that site. In order to end up with a farm like this, ecologically sound, economically profitable. Thank you, folks, for bearing with me tonight. And Stephanie, if you want to do the questions thing, if you're there. She went to sleep. Oh, there you go.
Hi, Mark. Doesn't look like we have too many questions. Everybody out there, let us know if you have any questions. We have the time to answer it. What I did see, Ray has a question for you and asked, would it be okay to contact you on your website for a question?
Maybe you should ask that question on the website. Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, see, the thing is, on the website, I might not get it. It might be, Karen is dealing mostly with trees and shrub sales and questions like that. Jeffrey's dealing mostly with questions on scheduling, and Wayne deals with other questions. You deal with other questions. So they might not get to me. The way to do it is now. You got me live. Ask a question.
Great. Plenty of people to ask questions to.
Sure.
Oh, looks like we got another one. Along with your book, what other books would you recommend to learn about ecological succession?
Well, let me. How fast can I zip through here? But right back to the beginning of this webinar here. The one I really like because of its depth and intensity is the big one right there to the lower left. I think it is. Oh, gee, it's a long way back, isn't it? Don't get dizzy and fall off your seat, people. That one, Forest Ecology. There's numerous different editions. What it is it's the introductory forest ecology undergraduate level text that it's updated continuously by committee, and people submit papers to it all the time. This is, I'd say, is the basic fundamental understanding part of it. And understanding your disturbance regime where you are, just learn a little bit about the weather. Are you in an earthquake zone? Are you in a volcano area? Are there a lot of, like where I'm at in southwest Wisconsin, it's more individual trees will get struck by lightning and die, or a tornado goes through and rips out a little path in the woods. So it's more smaller scale disturbances. And there are the, wind can be devastating across hundreds of square miles, or it can be just this little microburst that knocks down a few trees. And the disturbance happens at all of those scales. So to look at the vegetation that's existing in your place right now and understand what happened to it to get it in that particular, that's as instructive as reading any book. I'd recommend just this book, and then observe, observe, observe. That's my favorite right there. Look at that. See, observation. Other questions? Well, I'll get everybody dizzy looking at these pictures again. These are nice. If you just go online and look at all these different things about succession, the thing is, some of it has elements that are not true. One of the, in how I could tell you which ones are which, I can't get into that now. So you got to just watch out. That's why I recommended that text, because it's all peer-reviewed and stuff like that. One of the things that really bothered me is it was just last week that one of the major permaculture educational publications put out this thing on how you build good soil by not disturbing it. Well, in places, yes, that's true. But when you start mixing the mineral soil with this, it's like composting. Let it develop a little bit more. You have more mixing with the minerals and the organic matter, more life is acting on it. You keep it ramped up in high gear and then do some mixing again. So a strategic mixing like nature does with this pit and mound here, through the movement of sand dunes. My goodness, how often is the soil getting mixed? This is a natural, perfectly normal way to build soil. Can also include a certain degree of actually disturbing the soil and mixing it around. So anyways, what other question?
I have one more for you. It says, how has your training as an engineer influenced your understanding of ecology? I sense it's been very influential.
Well, I had all kinds of wise guy comments that I was just going to make about that. But the engineering thing for me is I wanted to know how things work. And then I wanted to make things that would, tools that would help me get by easier. But when I went to engineering school, what they wanted to do was train me to be a good employee and learn how to make better door handles for Volkswagens or something like that. It's like, that's not what I wanted to do. Actually, I got into helmets because I want to help people with severe head trauma and all that kind of whatever. And I ended up just being a lab rat, smashing helmets to see, well, gee, yep, broke that one, these many pounds. Oh, wow, broke that one, yep, these many pounds. And it was just, it wasn't any fun. So how has it affected my understanding of ecology? I think part of it is that intensity and that desire to understand how things work. And just looking at this picture right here, you have that tree that blew down. You've got this mound. You've got this pit. This is fascinating. I could look at this and just totally get off on this for hours and hours and hours, because look at all of the different amazing things that are happening here that we can talk about. We've got some primary succession going on with the lichen on the rock and the moss, and then we've got this debris blowing in. We've got the decomposition going on. This fungal mycelia kind of going through this whole thing. The fungus is now going to be, propagating all through the wood, decaying the wood, obviously decaying wood up here. This is an amazing thing. I think the engineering isn't what got me to be so enthralled with ecology. Maybe it's my natural curiosity and the fact that right there fascinates the dickens out of me. That's absolutely amazing. Yeah, I'd rather do that than go chase Pokemon any day of the week. Just look at that. I think I successfully avoided answering that question, didn't I? Come on, look at that. Look at this. There's like 1,000 years worth of history in there. And it's all related to wind, and it's all related to these species, how they've interacted with wind on a site that's on a bare rock in northern Minnesota. It's amazing. So, question.
Awesome. Well, we are a little bit over the hour, but I'll throw this last question out there. We have one person wondering if, he says, plant migration is based on trends of climate change. Is it a risk if trends change for your own property?
The risk is to not be trying things in all different directions. The risk is to say, well, we don't know which way things are going. I've got one side of my property, I've gone northern with it, and I'm planting a lot of boreal, subboreal species on that side of it. It's more north facing, it's colder already, shadier. Then I've got on my southwest bony rocky slope, I've got a lot of things from mountainous Colorado regions going into the hotter, drier side of things. I'm playing with both. We don't know which way things are going to spin out here. Um, uh, it's been so humid in Wisconsin and so wet in Wisconsin. I've just been wondering, why don't we just start making coal swamps and start getting into the coal production business by damming up these valleys, growing trees, then dropping a couple trees in order to flood the valley 2 feet deep, and all the trees fall over. Then we grow more trees on those and just keep filling the valley up full of these rotten logs. We got more carbon in the atmosphere. This is the Carboniferous all over again. And don't think for a minute that all this coal was made by these plants just growing peacefully and falling over when they were old and dying. All of the coal deposits were made by plants and animals living in ecological systems that were impacted by disturbance. So yeah, I would experiment in both different directions, but I wouldn't do that until I take care of now. Establish your site, set up your food system, and feed yourself now. Plant enough so that you generate a surplus that's going to make it worth your while to harvest, so then you can have extra dollars from the sale of product or gifts to friends and all that kind of stuff. Then start experimenting on the fringes with different zones, because we have no idea which way it's going, really.
Great answer, Mark. Well, since we are past the hour, I think we might just wrap things up. Thank you, everybody, for your engagement. Almost everybody stayed on to the very end. Any final thoughts, Mark?
Well, we're going to continue with succession next week, and if there's any major successional events, actually, since we're going to talk a little bit about fire, if there's any fires anywhere nearby, somebody send me a line, and I'm going to go check them out, and we'll report live from the scene. We'll see you next week. Thank everybody for being here.
Thanks, everybody.